Welcome to The Last Hike. Now, what do you think happens when three influencers turn Half Dome into a content shoot? Well, park rangers already knew. Armed with outfit changes and baseless confidence, every ounce of common sense was ignored, and what happens next will make you think twice before you ever let a follower count convince you a mountain owes you anything. This happened back in September 12th of 2017, up on Half Dome in Yosemite National Park, and it involved three wealthy lifestyle influencers from Los Angeles who flew in for what they thought was going to be a luxury adventure content trip. They had followings built on fashion, travel, and wellness, and they came to Yosemite with one goal in mind: get the perfect sunset photo from the top of Half Dome. That was it. That was the whole plan. Before I get into who these women were, I think it helps to understand exactly what Half Dome actually is. A lot of people who have never been to Yosemite picture it as just another scenic walk. Well, it's not that. Half Dome rises about 8,000 to 800 feet above sea level, and the hike to the top and back covers somewhere between 14 and 16 miles, depending on which trailhead you start from. The last 400 feet of that climb is the part everyone talks about, the cable section, where two steel cables run straight up a slab of smooth granite at an angle steep enough that you are essentially pulling your own body weight up using your arms and shoulders. Wooden boards are bolted in at intervals so people can pause and catch their breath, but there is nothing soft about that climb. The rangers who worked that day later admitted that they got a bad feeling almost the second these three showed up at the trailhead. Not because they looked unfit or unprepared in an obvious way, but because nothing about their approach matched what Half Dome actually demands. And look, here's the thing that bothers me about a 400-foot wall of granite with steel cables bolted into it. It doesn't care who you are or how many followers you have. It treats a movie star and a first-time tourist exactly the same way. That should have been obvious to anyone planning a trip there, and somehow it was not obvious to three people who built entire careers on planning trips. I've looked into a handful of other Half Dome cable incidents while researching this episode, and one detail comes up again and again in the official guidance the park puts out every single season. Rangers specifically tell visitors not to attempt the cables if there is any chance they will still be up there after the sun goes down, because the route has no lighting, no rescue access in the dark, and almost no margin for a single misstep. That warning is printed on signs at the trailhead, repeated by rangers stationed along the route, and posted on the park's own website months before anyone even books a flight. None of that information is hidden or hard to find. These three simply never went looking for it. Kaya Park, 26, was a luxury travel influencer known for prioritizing visually impressive content over practical planning. Coming from a wealthy background, she had a reputation for taking risks to get unique photos. She had spent months planning a specific Half Dome sunset photo, studying other summit images, and carefully preparing her outfit and lighting for the shot. That detail about studying other people's photos for 6 months tells you that she spent more time planning the aesthetics of this shot than she spent actually learning anything about the mountain itself. 6 months of Pinterest boards and 0 minutes reading a single Park Service safety bulletin. That is not a small gap in preparation. That is the entire preparation missing. It also tells you something about how Kaya approached risk in general, not just on this trip. People who knew her described a pattern where she would scout a location entirely through other people's photos, and then assume that if someone else got the shot safely, she could too, without asking what conditions that other person was hiking in, what time they started, or what gear they were carrying. Copying someone's finished photo is not the same as copying their planning, and that distinction seems to have been completely lost on her going into this trip. The second woman was 25 years old, Noah Rosen. She was a fitness and wellness influencer, the type who posted constantly about discipline, endurance, and mental toughness. She had done plenty of difficult workouts and short hikes, and she genuinely believed that being physically fit could get you through almost any outdoor challenge. The problem I found was that she had basically no experience with long alpine-style climbs, the kind where conditions change fast and the terrain doesn't care how strong your legs are. Throughout this whole ordeal, Noah became the group's main voice of confidence whenever anyone raised a concern, and that confidence ended up being incredibly dangerous. What gets me about Noah specifically is the mismatch between her brand and her actual skill set. Kaya's entire brand was built around pushing through discomfort and refusing to quit. That mindset works in a controlled gym environment, but it does not necessarily apply to a mountain. She repeatedly dismissed warnings during the climb, suggesting she viewed every obstacle as something that could be overcome through determination, rather than recognizing that some risks require caution instead of persistence. The third woman was 24-year-old Catalina. She was a fashion and lifestyle influencer focused on luxury brands and curated travel photography. Out of the three of them, she had the least hiking experience by far, and she leaned heavily on Kaya and Noah whenever a decision needed to be made outdoors.
From what I understand, she agreed to the Half Dome climb mostly because the summit shot just fit the visual style she wanted for her page. She wasn't someone who wanted to be there for the challenge, she wanted to be there for the content. Of the three women, Catalina is the one I keep thinking about differently than the other two.
She was not the one pushing for the climb, and she was not the one arguing with rangers. She just trusted that the other two had this handled because they sounded so sure of themselves all day.
I think that's the most relatable mistake in this entire story.
Most of us have been the third person in a group, the one who goes along because everyone else seems confident, and most of the time that works out fine. This time it did not, and that gap between most of the time and this time is exactly what makes outdoor accidents so brutal. Catalina had the least outdoor experience in the group, leaving her with no real basis to judge whether the other's confidence was informed or reckless. Unlike Kaya and Noah, she couldn't distinguish between genuine expertise and misplaced assurance driven by social media goals. By the time she might have realized the difference, it was already too late. They arrived at the trailhead much later than recommended. Rangers notice immediately that their schedule makes little sense, because most people attempting Half Dome start before sunrise. These three did not start until late morning. A ranger at the base told them directly that they were starting dangerously late, that they should expect to be descending long before sunset, and that Half Dome simply was not a sunset destination for hikers without serious experience. The women laughed and explained that they were used to extreme travel. One ranger later recalled that this was the exact moment he realized these three did not understand where they actually were. A late morning start on a 14-mile round trip is not a small scheduling error. It is close to giving away half the daylight before you have taken a single step.
And the laugh is the part I can't get past. You can forgive someone for not knowing the mileage or the elevation gain off the top of their head.
It is much harder to forgive someone for being told directly by a trained ranger that their plan is dangerous and responding with a laugh instead of a single follow-up question.
I think about what a single follow-up question would have actually cost them at that moment.
Something as simple as asking how many hours the round trip typically takes, or whether other hikers ever attempt a sunset summit and what happens to them on the way down. That question takes 10 seconds to ask and could have completely changed the rest of the day. Instead, they treated a direct safety warning from a uniformed professional the same way they might treat an unsolicited comment from a stranger online, something to brush past rather than something to actually weigh. When the rangers later went through what these women actually packed, it painted a pretty clear picture of where their priorities were. They brought multiple outfit changes, several pounds of camera gear, tripods, cosmetic bags, portable lighting equipment, and battery packs for all of it. What they left behind was almost unbelievable. No headlamps, not enough water for a hike of that length, no emergency layers for when the temperature drops at elevation once the sun goes down, no backup batteries for actual navigation equipment, just for their cameras and lights. They apparently assumed their smartphone flashlights would be enough to get them down a vertical granite face in total darkness if it came to that. A headlamp costs about $20 and weighs next to nothing. An extra liter of water adds maybe 2 pounds to a pack that already had several pounds of camera equipment stuffed into it. So this was not a weight problem, and it was not a cost problem. This was three women deciding, without ever saying it out loud, that the equipment for capturing the moment mattered more than the equipment for surviving it. That is the single packing list detail that tells you everything about how this day was framed before it even started.
I went back and forth on whether to call this an oversight or a decision, because oversight makes it sound accidental, like nobody thought about it.
But three separate people packed three separate bags for this trip, and not one of them flagged a headlamp as worth bringing, while all three somehow agreed that portable lighting rigs for video were essential. That is not an accident. That tells you what each of them, independently, considered a priority for this day, and survival gear simply did not make the list. The hike becomes a content production day instead of a climb. Every major viewpoint becomes a photo shoot, an outfit change, video shoots for social media, multiple retakes. At Vernal Fall, they stopped for 45 minutes. At Nevada Fall, nearly an hour. At Little Yosemite Valley, another extended break for sponsored content. By mid-afternoon, they were already behind schedule. Add that up with me for a second. 45 minutes, then close to 60, then another extended stop on top of that. That is somewhere around 2.5 hours burned on photography alone before they even reach the halfway point of the climb, and none of that includes the actual walking time. A normal round trip for an early starting, steady hiker takes somewhere between 10 and 12 hours total. These three spent almost a quarter of that entire budget on tripod angles before they had gone half the distance. And the part that should scare you is that the hardest section, the cables, was still completely ahead of them.
What really gets me is that none of these 3 stops happened at locations where stopping made any logical sense from a safety standpoint.
Vernal Fall and Nevada Fall are beautiful, sure, but they are also exactly the kind of spot where a long pause eats directly into the cushion you need for the summit attempt later. A smart group plans its long stops near the beginning of a trip when there is daylight to spare and keeps things moving once the harder terrain starts. This group did the opposite without seeming to notice, treating every waterfall like it existed in its own bubble with no connection to the hours ticking away on the rest of the route. A backcountry ranger encounters them near Subdome. He notices their pace, their equipment, and the amount of remaining daylight. He strongly recommends turning around immediately, skipping the summit, and returning another day. He explains that sunset photography is not worth descending the cables in darkness. Kaya insists they only need a few pictures. The ranger is unconvinced. A few pictures is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it is worth sitting with for a second. A few pictures implies a quick stop, in and out, nothing that should cost real time. But we already know from Vernal Fall and Nevada Fall that a few pictures for this group meant 45 minutes minimum. Kaya was not lying to the ranger exactly. She was lying to herself about what a few pictures had actually been costing them all day. And that self-deception is a much harder thing to argue someone out of than a simple misunderstanding.
I find it interesting that the ranger near Subdome didn't just repeat the generic safety message every hiker gets at the trailhead.
He looked specifically at their pace and their gear before forming his recommendation, which tells me he was reading the situation in real time rather than just reciting a script. That is a more informed warning than the first one they received, built on actual evidence of how the day had gone so far, and it still did not land any harder than the first warning had. The climb is taking much longer than expected, and signs of trouble emerge. Catalina is exhausted, water supplies are running low, Noah develops leg cramps. Several hikers descending warn them they are cutting it too close. They dismiss every concern. Noah repeatedly says they are almost there, despite the fact that they still have the hardest section ahead. I want to single out the leg cramps specifically, because that is not a vague feeling of being tired. That is your body sending a very concrete signal that it is running low on water and electrolytes. Cramps at altitude on a long climb are the kind of thing a hiking guide would treat as a hard stop, not a minor inconvenience to push through. Noah, the fitness influencer, whose whole brand was built around understanding her own body, either did not recognize what cramping actually meant, or recognized it and decided the summit mattered more anyway. Neither option reflects well on someone whose entire platform is built on physical expertise. And it was not only their own bodies sending warning signs. Hikers who had already summited and were heading back down took the time to stop and tell them directly that they were cutting things too close, which means strangers, with no reason to lie and nothing to gain, were independently reaching the same conclusion as the rangers. When your own cramping legs, your dwindling water supply, and total strangers coming down the mountain are all telling you the same thing at the same time, that is not a single data point you can dismiss. That is 3 unrelated sources of information all converging, and converging warnings like that almost never turn out to be wrong. Noah's repeated line that they were almost there is also worth examining on its own, because almost there can mean wildly different things depending on what is actually left to cover. From where they were standing, the remaining distance was short in terms of feet, but the remaining difficulty was the steepest, most exposed section of the entire route. Measuring how close you are by distance instead of by difficulty is exactly the kind of error that turns a hard day into a fatal one, and it is an error a more experienced alpine hiker would never have made. At the cable section, they stop repeatedly, take photos while climbing, film social media videos, and hold poses while other hikers wait. Several hikers become irritated. One warns them that this is not the place to be messing around. The women continue, and their summit arrival is delayed even further. The cables only fit one direction of traffic comfortably at a time, which means every pose they held was not just slowing themselves down, it was forcing strangers behind them to dangle on a steel cable bolted into granite while waiting for an outfit check. That is the moment in the story where this stops being purely about their own risk tolerance and starts putting other people in an uncomfortable, exposed position against their will.
I don't think the women were trying to be reckless towards strangers. I think that they had simply stopped noticing that other people existed on the route at all.
There is a specific kind of tunnel vision that comes from being on camera, where the people standing just outside the frame stop registering as real obstacles to consider. I imagine that is exactly what happened here. Every pause for a photo probably felt, in the moment, like it was costing 30 seconds, when in reality, each one was forcing a line of strangers to stand still on an exposed cable route with nothing but a steel wire between them and a very long fall. The frustrated hiker who finally spoke up was not being rude. He was pointing out something that should have been obvious from the very first pose. Near the summit, a ranger descending gives what becomes the final warning. He explains that they need to leave almost immediately, that darkness comes quickly, the granite becomes difficult to navigate, and temperatures are dropping. He tells them plainly that staying for sunset is going to create a serious problem getting down. They assure him they will leave soon. 3 rangers, 3 separate locations along the route, 3 independent warnings, all saying some version of the same thing without ever coordinating with each other. That consistency is the part I keep coming back to. When 3 different professionals who have never spoken to each other that day all reach the identical conclusion within a span of a few hours, that is not caution, that is a pattern being read correctly by everyone except the 3 people it actually applied to. I think it is also worth noticing how the tone of these warnings escalated as the day went on. The first ranger at the trailhead was informative, almost matter-of-fact. The second one near Subdome was firmer, specifically recommending they turn around. By the time the third ranger caught them near the summit, he was described as unusually direct, going out of his way to spell out exactly what kind of problem they would face. That escalation is not rangers becoming more dramatic for no reason. That is professionals adjusting their language in real time because the danger genuinely kept increasing with every hour that passed, and each one of them could see it clearly even from a single brief encounter. Once on top, the summit becomes an outdoor studio. Outfit changes continue, tripods are repositioned dozens of times, hundreds of photos are taken, video filming consumes even more time. The sun begins dropping, other hikers leave. The summit gradually empties, the women remain.
The summit gradually empties is the detail I would put at the center of this whole episode if I had to pick just one.
Every single other person standing on that rock looked at the same fading light and made the same calculation and walked away. That is not a ranger giving advice that could be dismissed as overly cautious. That is dozens of ordinary strangers, with no authority and nothing to gain from being right, all independently voting with their feet. Watching that happen around you and still staying for more shots is choosing to ignore the clearest, least biased warning available that day. Picture the actual scene for a second. A crowded summit at golden hour, dozens of people taking in the same view, and then slowly, group by group, the crowd starts thinning out as people head for the cables while there is still usable light. By the time the sun is actually setting, the 3 of them are likely standing in a space that used to be packed and is now mostly empty, with maybe a handful of stragglers left. That kind of visual should hit differently than any verbal warning, because it requires no interpretation at all. It is just math playing out in front of your eyes. And somehow, it still was not enough. Sunset arrives. The photographs look incredible. The women celebrate. But now, the trail is almost empty, the cables are below them, and darkness is spreading across the granite. One hiker heading down urges them to follow. They stay behind for just a few more shots. That decision ultimately seals their fate. I keep replaying that phrase, just a few more shots, because by this point in the day, it had already been said in some form at least 4 separate times, at Vernal Fall, at Nevada Fall, on the cables, and now here at the summit with no daylight left to spend. It worked as an excuse every previous time because there had always been enough daylight cushion left to absorb the cost. This was the first time it was said with absolutely no cushion remaining, and nobody in the group seemed to register that the math had finally run out. This is also where I think the hiker who urged them to follow deserves more credit than he probably ever got. He had no obligation to say anything at all. He could have just kept walking down, focused on his own descent, and nobody would have blamed him for it. Instead, he stopped, specifically addressed them, and tried to get them moving while there was still a sliver of usable light left. That is one more independent voice added to a pile of warnings that already included 3 rangers and a thinning summit crowd, and it still was not enough to change their minds. By the time they reach the cables, the sun is gone. Moonlight is limited. Their phones are already losing battery. The granite surface is difficult to see. The steel cables disappear into darkness below. Several descending hikers pass using proper headlamps. The women are struggling to make out the route ahead. Panic begins to replace confidence. Granite holds heat from the sun during the day, and then cools fast once the sun sets, which means condensation can start forming on the surface right around the time these 3 were finally descending, on top of failing phone batteries and 0 headlamps between them. Every single piece of bad luck stacking up in this paragraph traces directly back to a choice made hours earlier. The condensation was always going to happen at that hour. The only variable that changed was whether a hiker was still on the cables when it did, and that variable was entirely in their control. What makes this paragraph so hard to read is that none of these individual problems would have mattered much on their own. Limited moonlight alone is manageable with a headlamp. A dying phone battery alone is manageable if it is not your only light source. Slick granite alone is manageable if you can actually see where your feet are landing. It was the combination of all four happening at once, stacked directly on top of each other, that turned a difficult descent into an impossible one. And every one of those four factors traces back to a decision that could have been made differently earlier in the day. Kaya reaches a congested section of the cables. Attempting to let another climber pass, she steps outside the designated path. Her shoe loses traction on smooth granite. Witnesses hear a scream. She disappears over the edge. Noah instinctively reaches toward her, shifts her weight forward while trying to look over the edge, and loses her grip on the cable. She falls seconds later. Catalina remains frozen on the cables for several minutes, then attempts to descend alone, slips on moisture forming on the cooling granite, and slides off a steep section below the main cable route. I am not going to dramatize this any further than I already have, because 3 people lost their lives within a span of just a few minutes, and that deserves to be treated with weight, rather than turned into a spectacle. What I will say is that almost every factor in this sequence, the darkness, the congestion, the wet granite, the panic, had been predicted out loud by Rangers hours earlier in the day. Rangers launched a search operation overnight, but darkness prevented immediate recovery efforts, and search teams already feared the worst because of where the falls occurred. At first light, all 3 bodies were located below separate sections of the route, and phones containing hundreds of summit photographs were recovered. None contained images of the descent. Several Rangers later stated privately that they had expected an accident long before sunset, not because the women were unlucky, but because every warning they received throughout the day had been ignored, and each bad decision pushed them closer to a situation that experienced hikers spend years learning to avoid.
The thing I keep landing on after putting this whole episode together is that nobody failed to warn them.
3 Rangers tried, dozens of strangers tried just by leaving when they left, and the math of a fading sunset tried in its own quiet way the entire afternoon. The only thing missing that day was someone inside that group willing to value a warning over a photograph, even just once.